The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the red earth, casting long shadows across the canyon where death had recently visited. Jack Morrison sat hunched over his campfire, stirring beans in a dented tin pot, when the sound reached him, a low, pained groan carried on the desert wind. He froze, his weathered hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. 3 days had passed since the skirmish at Devil's Canyon, where a cavalry patrol had clashed with Apache raiders. Jack had been riding fence for the Henderson Ranch when he'd heard the gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. By the time he'd reached the scene, both sides had retreated, leaving only scattered brass casings and dark stains on the rocks to tell the tale. The groan came again, weaker this time, from behind a cluster of barrel cacti about 50 yards from his camp. Jack's jaw tightened as memories flooded back. Memories of his younger brother Tom, found scalped and mutilated 3 months ago near the same canyon. The Apache had taken everything from him: his brother, his peace of mind, and any hope of building a life in this harsh territory. Rising slowly, Jack checked his rifle and moved cautiously toward the sound. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried the scent of sage and creosote. As he rounded the cacti, he stopped dead in his tracks. An Apache warrior lay crumpled against the rocks, his bronze skin slick with sweat and blood. A cavalry bullet had torn through his shoulder, and another had creased his thigh. The man's traditional clothing was torn and stained, his long black hair matted with dust and dried blood. His breathing was shallow, labored, and his lips were cracked from thirst. Jack's hand tightened on his rifle. This could be the very man who had killed Tom. The warrior's war paint was smeared but still visible, the same markings Jack had seen on the raiders who'd attacked the settlement. Every instinct screamed for revenge, for justice, for the satisfaction of watching this enemy die slowly in the desert heat. But as Jack stared down at the wounded man, something stirred in his chest. A memory from long ago, from the war that had shaped him into the hard man he'd become. He remembered lying wounded in a Tennessee field, Confederate gray soaked with his own blood, watching a Union soldier approach with a canteen. That blue-coated enemy had saved his life with a simple act of mercy. The Apache warrior's eyes fluttered open, dark and pain-filled. When he saw Jack standing over him, rifle ready, he didn't flinch or beg. Instead, he met Jack's gaze with quiet dignity, prepared to die with honor. The warrior's lips moved slightly, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in acceptance of his fate. Jack stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, wrestling with the demons of his past and the choice before him. The logical thing was to walk away, to let the desert claim this enemy as it had claimed so many others. But the memory of that Union soldier's kindness haunted him, along with something deeper, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his mother's, reminding him of the man she'd raised him to be. Without a word, Jack set down his rifle and walked back to his camp. The warrior's eyes followed him, confusion replacing the stoic acceptance. Jack returned with his water skin and a handful of clean rags torn from his spare shirt. The Apache watched in silence as Jack knelt beside him, unscrewing the cap of the water skin. "Easy now," Jack murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He lifted the warrior's head gently and brought the water to his lips. The Apache drank greedily, water running down his chin and mixing with the dust on his chest. When he'd had enough, Jack carefully examined the wounds. The shoulder wound was the worst, a clean entry but no exit, meaning the bullet was still lodged deep in the muscle. The thigh wound was messier but less dangerous, a furrow that had torn through flesh without hitting bone. Jack worked in silence, cleaning the wounds with precious water and binding them with his makeshift bandages. As he worked, Jack found himself studying the warrior's face. The man was young, perhaps 25, with strong features and intelligent eyes. There was something noble about him, a quiet strength that reminded Jack of officers he'd served under in the war. This wasn't some savage raider. This was a man of standing among his people. The warrior endured the painful treatment without complaint, never taking his eyes off Jack's face. When Jack finished binding the wounds, he helped the Apache drink more water, then fashioned a crude pillow from his saddle blanket and placed it under the man's head. "You'll live," Jack said quietly, more to himself than to the warrior. "Desert won't claim you today." The Apache tried to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. Jack leaned closer, catching fragmented words in a language he didn't understand. The warrior's hand moved weakly toward a leather pouch at his belt, and Jack helped him retrieve it. Inside were sacred items, a piece of turquoise, an eagle feather, and a small carved figure that looked like a horse. With trembling fingers, the warrior pressed the carved horse into Jack's palm, his eyes intense with meaning. Jack stared at the small figure, feeling its weight beyond its size. He understood. This was payment, or perhaps gratitude, offered in the only way the wounded man could manage. "Keep it," Jack said, trying to press the carving back, but the Apache's hand closed around Jack's, holding the gift in place. The warrior's eyes conveyed what words could not: respect, gratitude, and something that transcended the hatred between their peoples. As night fell over the desert, Jack built up his fire and settled down nearby, his rifle across his knees. The Apache slept fitfully, sometimes muttering in his native tongue, sometimes calling out names that sounded like prayers. Jack found himself checking on the man throughout the night, adjusting his blanket, giving him water when he stirred. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the desert grew cold and the stars blazed overhead, Jack stared into the dying embers of his fire and wondered what he'd done. Tom's memory weighed heavy on his conscience, along with the knowledge that come morning, he'd have to decide what to do with his unlikely patient. The warrior stirred at first light, his fever broken and his eyes clearer. He struggled to sit up, and Jack helped him, noting that the bleeding had stopped and the wounds looked clean. The Apache studied Jack's face in the growing light, as if memorizing every line and scar. "Can you ride?" Jack asked, knowing the man probably couldn't understand English but needing to ask anyway. The warrior nodded slowly, then pointed toward the eastern rim of the canyon. Jack helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight, and together they made their way to where Jack's horse was tethered. The Apache looked at the animal with appreciation. Jack rode a sturdy Mustang, well suited to the harsh country. Jack helped the warrior mount, then handed him the water skin and a small sack of jerky. The Apache accepted both with a nod, then reached into his medicine pouch again. This time he withdrew the eagle feather, pristine and sacred, and offered it to Jack. "No," Jack said firmly, stepping back. "That's yours." But the warrior persisted, his eyes pleading. Finally, Jack accepted the feather, understanding that to refuse again would be an insult. The Apache smiled. The first time Jack had seen any expression other than stoic endurance cross his face. The warrior guided the horse toward the canyon rim, moving slowly but steadily. At the edge, he turned back and raised his hand in what might have been a farewell or a blessing. Then he was gone, disappearing into the maze of rocks and ravines that led to Apache territory. Jack stood alone in the growing heat, the eagle feather in one hand and the carved horse in the other. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of another scorching day. He tucked both gifts into his shirt pocket, gathered his gear and prepared to return to the Henderson ranch. As he rode out of the canyon, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The hatred that had consumed him since Tom's death still burned in his chest, but it was tempered now by something else, a small flame of hope that perhaps, in this vast and violent land, there might be room for understanding between enemies. The morning sun climbed higher over the Henderson ranch as Jack Morrison rode through the gate, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust from the packed earth. The ranch house sat squat and solid against the horizon, its adobe walls a testament to the determination of those who chose to make their lives in this unforgiving land. Cattle dotted the nearby pastures, their lowing carried on the warm breeze that swept across the valley. Frank Henderson stepped out onto the porch as Jack approached, his weathered face creased with concern. At 62, Frank had spent the better part of his life fighting this land into submission, and the lines around his eyes spoke of countless mornings spent wondering if his ranch would survive another day. "Jack!" Frank called out, his voice carrying the weight of worry. "Been expecting you back since yesterday. Heard there was trouble at Devil's Canyon." Jack dismounted slowly, his joints protesting after the long ride. He'd been working for Henderson for 6 months now, ever since Tom's death had left him without family or direction. The work was honest, if dangerous, and it kept his mind occupied during the daylight hours. "Cavalry caught up with some Apache raiders," Jack replied, loosening his horse's cinch. "Both sides took casualties and pulled back. Canyon's quiet now." Frank nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. "Martha's been worried sick. You know how she gets when there's Indian trouble." He paused, studying Jack's face. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son. Everything all right?" Jack hesitated, his hand unconsciously moving to the gifts hidden in his shirt pocket. How could he explain what had happened? How could he tell Frank that he'd saved the life of an Apache warrior, possibly one of the same men who'd been raiding the settlements? "Just tired," Jack said finally. "Been a long few days." Martha Henderson appeared in the doorway, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and her apron dusted with flour. She was a small woman, but her presence filled the porch with warmth and concern. "Jack Morrison, you get yourself in here this instant," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. "I've got biscuits coming out of the oven and coffee that's been waiting for you since dawn." The kitchen was warm and filled with the scent of fresh bread and bacon. Martha bustled about, filling a plate with food while Frank settled into his chair at the head of the worn wooden table. Jack took his usual seat, grateful for the normalcy of the routine. "Young Billy Martinez rode in from town this morning," Frank said, reaching for his coffee. "Brought news from the sheriff. There's been more raids up north. The Williamson place got hit 3 days ago." Jack's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Anyone hurt?" "Family got out, but they lost most of their cattle and the barn." Frank's jaw tightened. "Sheriff's organizing a posse, wants every able-bodied man to join up. Says it's time to teach these savages a lesson they won't forget." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He thought of the warrior he'd helped, the dignity in those dark eyes, the sacred gifts offered in gratitude. The idea of hunting down Apache families, of perhaps confronting the very man whose life he'd saved, filled him with a deep unease. "I'll ride with you," Jack said automatically, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Frank rose and moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle hanging above the door. "Riders coming in," he announced. "Looks like Sheriff Coleman and his deputy." Sheriff Coleman was a tall, lean man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence. He'd been keeping the peace in the territory for over a decade, and the weight of those years showed in his weathered face and careful movements. "Frank, Jack," he nodded as he entered the kitchen, accepting Martha's offer of coffee. "I suppose you heard about the Williamson place?" "Billy brought word this morning," Frank replied. "When do we ride?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about." Coleman settled into a chair, his spurs jingling softly. "Got word from the cavalry that they're pulling back to the fort. Seems there's been some kind of development in Apache territory." Jack felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of development?" "Don't rightly know," Coleman admitted. "Captain Morrison, no relation to you, Jack, sent word that there's been unusual activity in the mountains. Smoke signals, runners moving between camps. Something's got them stirred up." The eagle feather in Jack's pocket seemed to burn against his chest. He forced himself to remain calm, to keep his expression neutral. "Could be planning something big," Frank suggested. "Maybe gathering for a major raid." "Maybe," Coleman agreed, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "Or maybe something else entirely. Point is, the cavalry's not available for a joint operation, and I'm not fool enough to take a civilian posse into Apache territory without military support." After the sheriff left, Jack found himself unable to concentrate on his work. He rode fence mechanically, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. The unusual Apache activity, the smoke signals, the runners, was it connected to his encounter with the wounded warrior? That evening, as Jack sat on the porch of the boarding house where he'd taken a room, Martha Henderson came to find him. She settled into the chair beside him, her face soft with understanding. "You're troubled," she said. It wasn't a question. "We all are," Jack replied. "With the Apache stirred up and the cavalry pulling back, things could get bad fast." Martha was quiet for a moment, then reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, worn Bible. "Jack, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." He looked at her, seeing the concern in her eyes, the motherly intuition that had always made him feel transparent. "What happened out there at Devil's Canyon?" she asked. "And don't tell me nothing. I've seen that look before in Frank's eyes after he came back from the war. Something's eating at you, something that's got you looking like you're carrying the weight of the world." Jack sat there for a long moment, wrestling with the weight of his secret. Finally, he pulled out the carved horse and the eagle feather, holding them in his weathered palms. "I found a wounded Apache warrior," he said quietly. "He was dying, and I helped him." Martha's eyes widened, but she didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. He was shot up bad, left behind after the skirmish. I could have walked away, let the desert claim him. Should have, considering what they did to Tom. Jack's voice grew rough with emotion, but I couldn't. He was just a man, dying alone, and I couldn't let it happen. So you helped him, Martha said softly. Gave him water, cleaned his wounds, bound them up. He gave me these before he left. Jack held up the sacred items. I think they mean something important to his people. Martha reached out and touched the eagle feather gently. They do, she said. I've seen such things before when I was a girl. My father traded with the Apache sometimes in the old days when peace was possible. These are sacred gifts, Jack. They're not given lightly. But what if helping him makes things worse? Jack asked. What if all this activity in Apache territory is because of what I did? Then you'll deal with whatever comes, Martha said firmly. But Jack, you did the right thing. You showed mercy to an enemy, and that's something to be proud of, not ashamed of. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A young Apache rider had been spotted approaching the town, carrying a white flag and calling for parley. The message he carried would transform the understanding of recent events and set the stage for an unprecedented confrontation. The town of Mesquite Wells buzzed with nervous energy as Jack Morrison rode down the dusty main street. Men clustered in small groups outside the saloon, their voices low and urgent, while women peered anxiously from windows and doorways. The Apache message had spread through the settlement like wildfire, and the air itself seemed charged with anticipation and fear. Jack tied his horse to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, where a crowd had already gathered. Frank Henderson stood among them, his face grim and determined. Other ranchers and townspeople filled the space, their weathered faces reflecting the same mixture of curiosity and apprehension that Jack felt gnawing at his gut. Sheriff Coleman emerged from his office, holding a piece of bark in his hands. The Apache message had been inscribed on the smooth inner surface with charcoal and painted symbols that seemed to dance in the afternoon light. Quiet down, everyone, Coleman called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office. I've had Miguel Santos look at this message. He lived with the Apache for 2 years as a boy, knows their ways better than any of us. Miguel Santos stepped forward, a thin man with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. He'd been captured as a child during a raid and raised by an Apache family before being returned to his people as a teenager. His unique experience made him invaluable as a translator and mediator. The message comes from Nantan, the war chief of the Chiricahua, Miguel began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. He requests a meeting, a parley, to discuss something of great importance. He says it concerns a debt of honor that must be acknowledged. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Frank Henderson stepped forward, his jaw tight with suspicion. A debt of honor, he growled. What kind of debt could we possibly owe them? Miguel held up his hand for silence. There's more. Nantan says that one of our people showed mercy to his nephew, a warrior named Hawk Who Soars. This warrior was wounded and left for dead, but a white man saved his life, asking for nothing in return. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. The eagle feather in his pocket seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, and he was suddenly aware of every eye in the crowd. Nantan says this act of mercy has been witnessed by the spirits of his ancestors, Miguel continued, and that such kindness cannot go unacknowledged. He offers to meet at the old trading post at Willow Creek 3 days from now to honor this debt. The crowd erupted in confused voices. Some men called for rejection of the offer, suspicious of Apache treachery. Others argued for caution, suggesting they wait for cavalry support. It's a trap, Frank declared loudly. They want to lure us out into the open, where they can slaughter us all. Maybe, Coleman replied thoughtfully, but Nantan has never broken his word before. When he says parley, he means it. An elderly man named Samuel Garrett stepped forward. His white beard was stained with tobacco juice, and his eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd seen the cycle of violence repeat itself too many times. I've dealt with Nantan before, he said. He's a hard man, but he's honorable. If he says he wants to acknowledge a debt, then that's exactly what he means. Miguel looked at the bark message again, his brow furrowed in concentration. There's something else here. Hawk Who Soars is not just any warrior. He's Nantan's sister's son being groomed to lead the tribe someday. His life carries great significance. The weight of this revelation settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Jack realized he hadn't just saved any Apache warrior, but a future chief, a man whose death would have been a devastating blow to the tribe's future. "So, what do we do?" Coleman asked, looking around at the assembled men. "We go," said a voice from the back of the crowd. All eyes turned to see Jack Morrison pushing his way forward, his face pale but determined. "We go to the parley." Frank Henderson stared at his hired hand in surprise. "Jack, what's gotten into you?" Jack's throat felt dry as desert sand, but he forced himself to speak. "Because I think I might know something about this debt of honor." The crowd fell silent, sensing the gravity of Jack's words. Sheriff Coleman studied his face carefully. "What do you know, Jack?" Taking a deep breath, Jack reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the eagle feather and the carved horse. The sacred items seemed to glow in the afternoon sun, and several men gasped at their obvious significance. "3 days ago, I found a wounded Apache warrior in Devil's Canyon," Jack said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He was dying from bullet wounds left behind after the skirmish. I gave him water and tended his wounds." The crowd erupted in angry voices. Some men shouted accusations of treason, while others demanded explanations. Frank Henderson's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something that might have been understanding. "You helped one of them," someone shouted, "after what they did to your brother." "Yes," Jack replied simply, "because he was dying, and I couldn't just walk away and let him die." Coleman raised his hand for silence. "Tell us everything, Jack. Leave nothing out." So Jack told his story to the entire town. He spoke of finding the wounded warrior, of the choice between revenge and mercy, of the silent treatment and the sacred gifts offered in gratitude. He told them about the dignity in the Apache's eyes, the nobility he'd sensed beneath the war paint and bloodstains. When he finished, the crowd was quiet for a long moment. Then Samuel Garrett stepped forward and placed a weathered hand on Jack's shoulder. "Son," he said quietly, "you may have done something that none of us had the courage to do. You saw past the hatred to the man underneath, but not everyone was convinced." Frank Henderson's face was flushed with anger and betrayal. "You had no right," he said, his voice shaking. "Tom was like a brother to me too, and you helped one of the bastards who killed him." "Because Tom wouldn't have wanted me to let a man die," Jack replied steadily. "You knew him, Frank. You know he wouldn't have wanted that." Martha Henderson pushed through the crowd to stand beside Jack. Her face was calm, but her eyes blazed with fierce protectiveness. "Jack Morrison did what any decent human being should do," she declared. "He chose mercy over revenge. And if that makes him a traitor in your eyes, then maybe you need to take a long look at what kind of men you've become." Miguel Santos stepped forward again. "There's something else you should know. The Apache have laws about debts of honor. If Nantan truly believes he owes Jack Morrison a debt, then he's bound by sacred tradition to repay it." "What kind of repayment?" Coleman asked. Given the significance of saving his nephew's life, it could be substantial. Peace terms, perhaps, or safe passage for settlers. The possibility of peace hung in the air like a fragile soap bubble. After months of violence and fear, the idea that one man's act of mercy might lead to lasting peace seemed almost too good to be true. "I'll go," Jack said quietly. "Whatever happens, I'll face it. This all started because of what I did, so I should be the one to see it through." "You won't go alone," Coleman said firmly. "If we do this, we do it right. Small group, including Miguel to translate, and enough men to show respect without looking like a war party." As the crowd began to disperse, plans were made and preparations discussed. The parley would take place in 3 days at the old trading post at Willow Creek. Jack would be there, along with Sheriff Coleman, Miguel Santos, and a handful of other men chosen for their steady nerves and cool heads. The weight of destiny settled on Jack's shoulders like a heavy cloak. In 3 days, he would face the consequences of his decision, whatever they might be. The simple act of giving water to a dying enemy had set in motion events that could reshape the future of the territory. The old trading post at Willow Creek sat in a natural amphitheater of red rocks, its weathered adobe walls bearing witness to decades of commerce and conflict. Jack Morrison rode with the small delegation from Mesquite Wells, his horse's hooves echoing off the canyon walls as they descended toward the meeting place. Sheriff Coleman led the group, his face set in lines of determined calm. Miguel Santos rode beside him, occasionally pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the old days when the trading post had been a neutral ground respected by all. The delegation included Samuel Garrett and Dr. William Hayes, whose presence emphasized their peaceful intentions. As they crested the final ridge, the trading post came into view, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. The Apache had already arrived, and their numbers were far greater than anyone had expected. Hundreds of warriors filled the natural amphitheater, their horses picketed in orderly rows, while smoke from their cooking fires rose into the clear morning air. "There must be 300 of them," someone whispered. Miguel Santos studied the gathering with practiced eyes. "Look at the arrangement. They're not positioned for battle. This is a ceremonial gathering, a formal acknowledgement of something significant." At the center of the Apache formation, a group of elders and war chiefs sat in a circle around a small fire. Jack could make out the distinctive figure of Nantan, the war chief, whose reputation for both ferocity and honor was legendary throughout the territory. The ride down to the trading post felt like a journey into another world. Apache warriors watched their approach with stoic faces, their weapons visible but not threatening. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, and elderly women tended fires while keeping watchful eyes on the white visitors. A young warrior approached as they dismounted, gesturing for them to follow. Jack recognized him immediately. It was Hawkhu Saws, the man he'd saved in Devil's Canyon. The warrior's shoulder still bore the signs of his recent wounds, but he moved with quiet strength and dignity. Their eyes met across the small distance, and Hawkhu Saws nodded slightly, a gesture of recognition and respect that spoke volumes in the silence between them. The young Apache's face was painted with ceremonial symbols, and he wore the finest clothing his people could provide. "He looks well," Miguel observed quietly as they followed Hawkhu Saws toward the central fire. "The wounds have healed cleanly." The circle of elders and war chiefs parted as they approached, revealing Nantan in all his imposing presence. The war chief was a man of perhaps 50 years, his face marked by scars from countless battles, his eyes holding the wisdom and weight of leadership. Nantan rose as they approached, his movement fluid despite his age. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute command, and Miguel translated his words with careful precision. "Nantan welcomes the white men to this sacred gathering. He says that what happens here today will be remembered for generations, spoken of around fires when the current warriors have joined their ancestors." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "We come in peace, seeking understanding." Nantan listened, then gestured toward Jack. When he spoke again, his words carried an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "He says that among all the white men who have come to this land, one has shown honor," Miguel translated. "One has proven that mercy can exist between enemies, that the spirit of a true warrior lives in the heart of a man who chooses healing over harm." Jack felt hundreds of eyes upon him as Nantan continued speaking. The war chief's words painted a picture of the days following the rescue, how Hawkhu Saws had returned to his people, bearing news of the white man's kindness, how the story had spread through the Apache nation like wildfire. "Nantan says that his nephew was more than wounded in body," Miguel continued. "He was wounded in spirit, believing that all white men were enemies without honor. But one cowboy proved that honor can exist between peoples." The war chief paused, then gestured toward the gathered warriors. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of ceremony and tradition. "Today, the Apache nation acknowledges a debt that cannot be repaid with gold or horses or weapons. A life was saved, but more than that, hope was restored." Nantan reached into an ornate leather pouch and withdrew a peace pipe, carved from red stone and decorated with silver and turquoise. The war chief held it reverently, explaining its significance through Miguel's translation. This pipe belonged to his grandfather, who smoked it with Mexican traders in the old days when peace was possible. Nantan offers to smoke this pipe with the man who saved his nephew's life, to establish a bond of honor between their peoples. Jack stepped forward, his legs feeling weak beneath him. "I'm honored by the offer. But what does this mean for both our peoples?" Nantan smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered face. Through Miguel, he explained that the peace would be conditional on mutual respect. The Apache would end their raids on the settlements, but the white settlers would acknowledge Apache rights to certain traditional hunting grounds. "And if someone breaks the peace?" Coleman asked. Nantan's face grew serious as he replied, "Then the pipe will be broken, and the agreement will die with it. But while it remains whole, both peoples will be bound by honor to maintain the peace." The war chief then did something unprecedented. He walked over to Jack and placed his hands on the cowboy's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. When he spoke, his words were soft but carried to every person in the gathering. Nantan says that in saving his nephew's life, Jack Morrison proved that the white man's heart can hold honor, Miguel translated. He says that if one white man can choose mercy over revenge, perhaps there is hope for peace between all their peoples. The war chief stepped back and raised the peace pipe high above his head. The gathered Apache warriors began to chant, their voices rising in harmony until the sound echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Then, one by one, the warriors began to kneel. It started with Hawk Hussars, who dropped to one knee and bowed his head toward Jack. Then his companions followed, then the elders, then the war chiefs. Like a wave spreading across water, the entire Apache nation knelt before the cowboy who had chosen mercy over revenge. Jack stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Hundreds of proud warriors, men who had never bowed to any white man, knelt in acknowledgement of his single act of compassion. Nantan remained standing, the peace pipe still held high. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of prophecy. He says that this moment will be remembered as the day when honor triumphed over hatred, Miguel translated, tears streaming down his face. He says that future generations will speak of the cowboy who saved an enemy's life, and in doing so, saved both their peoples from destruction. Jack found his voice at last. "I accept the peace pipe, and I swear by everything I hold sacred that I will honor this agreement." The pipe ceremony that followed was unlike anything the white men had ever witnessed. Jack and Nantan sat facing each other while smoke from the sacred pipe rose between them, binding their peoples in a covenant of peace. As the formal ceremony ended, individual Apache warriors approached Jack, offering their own gestures of respect. Hawk Hussars was among the last to approach, carrying a magnificent war lance decorated with eagle feathers. "He says that this lance has taken many lives in battle," Miguel translated, "but today he offers it to you as a symbol of life preserved. He says that your mercy has shown him a different kind of courage, the courage to choose peace over war." Jack accepted the lance with trembling hands, understanding the magnitude of the gift. This was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of trust, of the bond that had been forged between former enemies. The ride back to Mesquite Wells was conducted in thoughtful silence. Each man processed what they had witnessed, understanding that they had been part of something historic. In the weeks that followed, the peace held. Apache and white settlers began to encounter each other without violence, tentative at first but with growing confidence. Trading resumed at the old post, and stories began to spread of the cowboy, whose mercy had changed the course of history. Jack Morrison became something of a legend, though he remained uncomfortable with the attention. The war lance given to him by Hawk Hussars hung above his bunk, a constant reminder of the power of mercy over revenge. Years later, when the story was told around campfires throughout the territory, people would speak of the day when an entire Apache nation knelt before a cowboy who had chosen compassion over hatred. They would remember how a single act of mercy had created waves of change that transformed enemies into neighbors. The peace pipe still rested in a place of honor in Nantan's lodge, its smoke having carried the hopes and dreams of two peoples to the spirits of their ancestors. And in Devil's Canyon, where it all began, the desert winds carried whispers of a different kind of courage, the courage to choose mercy when the heart cries out for revenge. Jack Morrison had learned that lesson in the most profound way possible, and in doing so had shown both peoples that even in the harsh landscape of the American frontier, there was room for honor, mercy, and hope.